Hey everyone, Mark here. Today I'm going to be showing you how to get started with the PMDG 737 by flying a short 15-minute flight that's going to take off and land at the same airport. This tutorial is going to be all about getting a feel for flying the 737. We're not going to get bogged down in all of the procedures and all of the little details of flying the airplane because we're just getting started and we're just looking to understand the basics. The easiest thing to get going quickly, even though it's not super realistic to do it this way, is to actually start from the runway. And for this flight, I'm on runway 23 at Auckland, New Zealand, and I prepared my flight plan ahead of time in SimBrief. SimBrief really makes getting all of the numbers that you're going to need to prepare the plane a whole lot easier. I won't go into a ton of detail on SimBrief here, but I will show you the basics just to get going for this simple flight. I entered the origin and the destination, which is just NZAA in both cases, into the right fields. I selected the 737 from the airplane drop-down list, and for the route, I had to do a little bit of research to figure out which departure procedure was going to fit what I was looking for. I settled on the FERT to Papa departure just because it looks basically like an extended traffic pattern that's going to loop around the airport and make it really easy to come back around and land in just a couple of minutes. I've also got another waypoint in the route. You can see right there, it's MRAG, which I picked out from the approach chart for runway 23 as a transition point that I was going to use. And we'll see a little bit more about why I did that in just a little bit as we're programming in the flight plan. The only other thing that I did was change the weight into pounds. By default, it's set to kilograms, but PMDG 737 uses pounds by default, so it's best to switch it up. And then just press the generate flight plan button and it's going to compute all of the information that I'm going to need to load into the plane. All right, we've got our flight plan set up, so let's pop back into the cockpit and we're going to use a shortcut to get the plane started. PMDG have some built-in tools that you can access from the FMC to quickly change the state of the airplane. And to access them, all you've got to do is first turn the battery power on by closing the guard, and then wait a couple of seconds for the screen to come alive. From there, I'm going to go into the PMDG setup and I'll click on load panel state. There are a bunch of predefined states that you can use as shortcuts to power up the airplane here. To scroll through the list, all you do is press the next page button until you get to the one that you're looking for. In this case, what I'm looking for is runway. That's going to do a few things for us once I click on that option and then press execute. For starters, it's going to align the IRS, which is what the airplane uses to determine its location. It's going to configure a bunch of other stuff on the overhead and even start the engines for us, even though normally you'd want to do all your flight prep first before starting the engines. The whole process is probably going to take about 30 to 45 seconds to bring the airplane to life, and in the meantime what we can do is go into the FS action menus and set up our fuel. The load sheet section of the flight plan says that we need about 6,200 pounds, so I'm going to type that into the scratch pad and load it into the fuel box that's right at the top. Alright, I'm going to go up a few levels now. I'm going to go into the FMC and start preparing the flight. The FMC starts off at the ident page, and you can see there's a message right at the bottom there that says that our nav data is out of date. The reason it's showing that is because it doesn't use Microsoft's nav database. You have to update it separately if you have a Navigraph subscription. You don't really need to worry about this if you're just going to be flying offline at the start when you're learning how to fly the airplane anyways. But if you are thinking of going on VATSIM, you're probably going to want to have that updated. To clear that message and any other message that might appear in the FMC, all you got to do is press the clear button that's on the bottom right. The next step is going to be to go to the pause init page by just clicking on the line key that's aligned with pause init at the bottom of the screen. If we were starting the plane from cold and dark, we'd have to initialize the position of the airplane on this page, but since we shortcutted it with the panel state, it did it automatically for us, so there's nothing that needs to be done here today, and we'll cover it probably in a future video where we do a cold and dark start. The route page is next, and the origin that we're going to be using in this case is NZAA for Auckland. So all you do again to load it in is just type it into the scratch pad and press on the button that's aligned with origin. And you're going to want to do the exact same thing for your destination, which is again going to be NZAA, since we're really just going to be getting up off the ground, going around and coming back to land. The route menu actually has two different pages, so if I press on the next page button, it actually brings me to the page where I would enter all of my route waypoints. But again, since today all we're using is our departure procedure and then going straight onto our approach, we don't actually have to enter anything on this page either. What I'll do instead is go into the departure arrival page to pick my procedures. From here, I'm going to click on the departure button, and then I'm going to scroll through the list of procedures until I find the one that I filed in SimBrief, which in this case is the FERT to Papa. You can see it's giving me a couple of options for the transition, but I'm actually not going to pick one because I want to go straight from the FERT waypoint, which is the last waypoint of the departure procedure, right to the beginning of the approach. So I don't need to pick anything there, but I will select runway 23 on the right hand side of the page to just confirm all of that. I'll go back to the departure arrival page again, and this time I'm going to click on the arrival option. And from the list here, again, I'm just going to scroll through it until I get to the ILS to 23 left, which is what we're going to be using for landing. For the transition point of the approach, I use the one that's furthest out, so that means it's the MRAG waypoint, which is all the way at the end of the approach procedure, and that's going to be our initial approach fix. Let's have a look what this looks like now. So I'm going to go to the lakes page, and I'm going to put the navigation display into plan mode. The step button that's on the bottom right is going to walk us through everything that we just programmed. So we're going to take off, we're going to go to our first waypoint. Then we're going to go up and around the airport at 6,000 feet across a couple of waypoints until we get the FERT. And then from there, you're going to notice there's actually a discontinuity. A discontinuity is basically anytime the airplane doesn't know what to do next and it needs our input. In this case, I want to go to the next waypoint of the route. So I'm going to click on the waypoint that's on the next page to load it into the scratch pad. Come back to the previous page, and I'm just going to click on the empty boxes right there to load that in. And now you can see that there's no more discontinuity. The route goes from the end of the departure procedure at the FERT waypoint to the beginning of the approach at the MRAG waypoint. And if I just keep pressing the step button and I loop through the whole flight plan another time again, you're going to see there are no more discontinuities, and I've got a nice complete loop from start to finish that takes off and lands on runway 23. Next, we're going to go into the perf init page, and to get there, all you got to do is press the init ref button. And from here, the first thing that I'm actually going to set is the cost index. This is the number that's used by airlines to figure out how much fuel you want to burn and how fast you want to fly. In our case, since we don't care about any of that, I usually use 88 because it's a nice number where you'll get a decent performance out of the airplane. Our cruise altitude for this flight is going to be 6,000 feet, so I'll plug that into the scratch pad and then load it in right at the top right. The fuel reserves number comes from the SimBrief flight plan, and if I have a look at my FinRes number, it says that it's about 2,000 pounds, so I'm going to plug in 2.1 into this field. Next up is the zero fuel weight, and that one's a really easy one to calculate. All you've got to do is press on the line select key that's next to zero fuel weight, and you can see it's going to populate it for you at the bottom, and then click it a second time to load it in. The next page we need to fill out is the N1 limit page. So if you click on the bottom right to get there, you can see on this first page there's actually nothing to be done. It's already selected our maximum takeoff thrust, so we can leave that as is for our first flights. It doesn't really matter. And we can click on takeoff at the bottom right to get to the takeoff ref page. And here we've got a couple of things to do. We can set the takeoff flaps here, and for the most part, you're always going to be using flaps 5. Next, if I press the CG button, it's going to calculate the center of gravity of the airplane. And if I click it a second time, it's going to show me that the trim that I need to use for takeoff is 4.65. To set that, I've got to go down to the trim wheel, and I'm looking to line up the notch to be somewhere between the 4 and the 5 that's shown on the trim wheel. The other thing that we need to do here is set the V-speeds, and that's just a single click next to each one of them because it's already pre-calculated it for us. And the V2 speed also needs to be set up on the MCP. And all we have to do for that is twist the IAS knob until it's set to 147. With that done, we are pretty much done with our FMC prep. So I'm going to go back to the box and I'm going to press on the route button. You can see there's an activate option right at the bottom. If I press on that, you can see that the execute light lights up. So once we press on execute, everything we set up now becomes the active flight plan. Next thing I'm going to do is go up again to the MCP. I'm going to set my cruise altitude to 6,000 feet so that it's automatically going to level off for me. I'll also enable both flight directors, first on the captain's side and then on the first officer's side. Let's do some final checks before takeoff. So the auto throttle is green and armed. And lastly, I'm going to try and arm both LNAV and VNAV just to make sure that they engage. I found the 737 is a little bit finicky about when it will allow you or not to engage in autopilot mode. Generally, it's because you forgot a step if something won't engage, so it's always best to go through again and double check everything. The first thing to check obviously is to make sure that your route is active, and also go to your climb page and make sure there's nothing here that's waiting for you to execute. Once I see that both LNAV and VNAV can engage, I'll usually disable VNAV and do my departure without it. Like that, once I enable the autopilot, it'll only take care of following my flight plan, and our vertical flight path and our airspeed will stay in our control. We're gonna get airborne in just a second here, but make sure that you've hit the like button if you haven't already. It's gonna do me a big favor, and it's actually also going to help out other simmers as well discover these tutorials to hopefully help them out as well. Takeoff in the 737 is actually a little bit tricky, so what we've got to do when we are ready to go is just bring the throttles up to about 40%, let them sit there for just about a second so that everything stabilizes, and then you can push them all the way in. You also have to tell the plane that you want it to go to toga power by pressing the little screw that's at the top of the MCP. In reality, the toga button is on the throttles, but PMDG have put it here instead just to make it a little bit more convenient so that you don't have to look down when you're starting to go down the runway. Next, keep an eye on your airspeed, and you're actually going to hear a call out at rotation speed, at which point just start very slowly pulling back on your controller because it's very easy to tail strike the 737 because it's so low to the ground. A couple seconds later, you're going to hear your autopilot say that you've got a positive rate of climb, and at that point it's time to bring the gear up. Once you're airborne, you can pitch up to about 15 degrees, and you're going to want to turn the autopilot on fairly soon as well by pressing the command button just to lighten your workload a little bit while you're still learning the airplane. At this point, you can bug up by turning the airspeed knob to 210 knots and progressively bring your flaps up as it's accelerating to that airspeed so that by the time you get to 210, they're completely up. And if you're ever wondering what setting your flaps are set at, there is a gauge that's very conveniently located right at the center, so it's just a quick glance away at any time. The last thing I'm going to do is enable VNAV, and what that's going to do is allow the airplane to control our airspeed, and it's going to continue our climb up to 6,000 feet. And if you have a look now, the indicated airspeed has blanked itself out, and in the primary flight display you can see it says 250 knots right on the top left in that slightly purple color, and that's telling us that the airplane's going to accelerate to 250 knots. We armed LNAV before departure, and you can see in the primary flight display it reflects that. It says LNAV right at the middle, and that means that once we come up on our first turn here, it's automatically going to follow it for us and we don't really have to do anything. Alright, I am flying parallel to the runway now. I'm a couple of miles to the south. You can see the airport just off to the left there, and I'm still at 6,000 feet cruising along, but I'm going to start setting up for the approach because it won't be long and we're going to start descending. We'll start by going to the init-ref page, and we've got to select our landing configuration and airspeed. And for the most part in the 737, you're going to be doing your landings at flaps 30. So you can select that option on the right hand side to load it into the scratch pad, and then you're going to set it in the flap speed entry that's just a couple rows below that. That's added a VREF mark on the airspeed tape, which we'll see in just a second, and it's also showing us the frequency of the ILS on the left hand side right there. And I need to set that in the nav radio on both the pilot's and the co-pilot side so that the autopilot can do its work properly. We've also got to set the course on the instrument panel, and again we need to do it on both sides so that the autopilot doesn't complain that it's missing some information. In this case, the inbound course is 231, so I'm just going to twist both course knobs to 231. At this point, the airplane is as prepared for landing as we can get it, and I'm going to wait just a little bit longer before starting the descent. Normally we could use VNAV for the descent, but on short flights like this, I find it's coming in a little bit too fast for my liking, and it's making it very difficult to get the airplane to the right airspeed for landing. If I stayed in VNAV mode, you can see there's a little top of descent marker on the screen right in front of us in green, and that's the point where it would actually start descending. That's really close to the beginning of the approach, so instead I'm going to start descending when I'm about 10 nautical miles out from the top of descent marker. So I'll start by coming out of VNAV, turning my altitude down to 3,000 feet and going into level change mode. Figuring out when I'm 10 nautical miles out is really easy by just looking at the little notches on the line that extends in front of the airplane on the navigation display. Each notch is 5 nautical miles out, and at the 10 nautical mile mark there's even a little 10 on the display to tell you how far it is. The nice thing about doing it this way is that by taking the plane out of VNAV, I can control the airspeed more closely myself, and I'm actually going to start bringing it down right away. I'm going to set it to about 240 knots to start. That's brought the auto throttle back to idle, and the plane is going to start descending any second now as soon as it gets a little bit closer to 240 knots. I've just been descending for the last couple of minutes and we're still in LNAV on the autopilot, so the plane's just following our flight plan and it's starting its turn back towards the airport now. And at this point I'm gonna reduce my airspeed even more to 210 knots just so I stay ahead of the game. If you find that you're having a hard time getting rid of excess speed on the descent, don't forget that you always have the speed brakes that are available to you. I'm using the speed brakes with the 737 a fair bit more than any other airliner that I've flown, and it's really easy to forget you've extended them. There is a little light to tell you that they are extended in front of you, but what I like to do is actually just keep my hands on the axis that I use for the speed brakes so I don't forget about it. The only other thing of note is we've come up on our level off altitude at 3,000 feet, which is where we're going to stay until we intercept the glide slope of the ILS. I'm about 5 nautical miles out from our last turn towards the final approach course, and I'm going to bring the speed down to about 200 knots now. I'm going to go to flaps 1 as well, with my goal being to be at flaps 10 by the time I'm 10 nautical miles out from the airport, which again we can just tell by looking at the little notches on the line that extends in front of the airplane. This is also the right time to enable approach mode, and you can see the moment I've done that the localizer and the glide slope arm themselves in white in the PFD. That means the plane is going to intercept and fly the final approach course as well as descend on the glide slope once it acquires the signal, and at that point they'll become the green active modes. In my case right now you can see that I've intercepted the localizer and I'm still in the process of intercepting the glide slope. Once I hit the 10 nautical mile radius, I'm trying to be at around 170 knots, and to help slow the plane down, I'm going to extend the speed brakes to bring it down a little bit faster, and that's going to allow me to keep extending the flaps as well. Generally, you're going to want to bring the gear down at about 5 nautical miles out, and that's that first notch in front of the airplane on the navigation display. And you can also do it a little bit earlier if you have excess airspeed that you need to burn off, because the gear is the best thing to slow the airplane down. You're going to want to fly the last couple of miles of final approach at VREF plus 10. So have a look at where your VREF is on the airspeed tape, and what you're going to do is twist the IIS knob to just set the purple speed bug accordingly, and the airplane should slow down for you. The last two things you need to do is arm the speed brakes so that it'll deploy automatically on touchdown, and at this point you can also go to flaps 30, which is going to be our final configuration for landing. The first few times that you try and land a 737, keep the autopilot on as long as possible, and the auto throttle can be a little bit finicky as well, so you really need to keep an eye on it. You're looking for somewhere around 55 to 60% throttle on your descent to maintain the correct airspeed and the correct glide slope. I tend to take control of the airplane when I'm about 2 to 4 nautical miles out. As I get more comfortable with it, I've been slowly disabling the autopilot further and further out. But for your first few tries, just do yourself a favor and let the airplane almost bring itself entirely down to the ground. You can see the distance that you are from the runway very easily in the DME that's shown on the primary flight display, and when you feel you're ready to, make sure to disable the autopilot first and then disable the auto throttle. And once those two are done, you're going to have a bunch of warnings going off that you can also disable by just pressing right in front of you on those little black buttons that are flashing red and yellow. As you get close to the ground, you're going to have a few callouts from the airplane to tell you you're getting very close to touching down, and I tend to bring the power back to idle when I'm about 20 feet off the ground. Don't forget the 737 is really low to the ground, and because of that reason you barely need to flare at all. Just hold your attitude and the main gear is going to touch down first. Once you're on the ground, you can go to full reverse to slow the plane down and keep those reversers out until you get to about 60 knots, and you can add in just a little bit of braking to just increase that speed at which you're losing your airspeed. And at this point, you've successfully completed your first flight. If you got to this point in the video and you haven't pressed the like button already, I'm going to encourage you to do so, and make sure that you're subscribed as well so that you don't miss the next video in this series.